Hello, I'm Mariam Mashiri, and this is the Iran War Today, our BBC News briefing, bringing you up to date with all you need to know from the last 24 hours of the US war with Iran. Well, let's start with some of today's key developments now. Iran says a deal with Oman, which could cement Iranian control over the vital maritime choke point, is in its final stages. 2 Israeli soldiers have been killed in southern Lebanon as it resumes strikes on the country for the first time in more than a month. President Trump rejects reports the US military has a shortage of some munitions and says information leakers will be hunted down and jailed. Another security crackdown in Iran. The intelligence ministry says 21 people who they allege are spies for Israel have been arrested. Well, we start with negotiations over the Strait of Hormuz, the vital energy choke point, which has profound implications for the global economy. Iran say they're close to finalising a deal with Oman to reopen the strait, which has been effectively closed since the start of the conflict in February. Both countries, which sit on opposite ends of the narrow strait, have been engaged in talks to jointly manage the key shipping route. Pakistan, which is mediating between the US and Iran, says it hopes an agreement will lead Washington and Tehran to resume talks and ultimately resolve their conflict. Well, if confirmed, a deal might help ease an economic crisis, but it could also strengthen Iranian control over the strait. Let's speak to Bahman Kalbasi from BBC Persia. Bahman, what details do we know about this deal? And if it is agreed, how much of a victory would it be for the Iranian leadership?
We know that the parameters, as the Iranians have explained, have been agreed to, that the strait will be managed by Iran and Oman, that some ships going inbound will be managed by Iran, and then Oman will see through it that those who are leaving the strait from the Persian Gulf can be doing so safely with coordination with Iran. And then the details are obviously the question that everybody wants answers to, including if there will be a toll. We've heard everything from 5% to 7% to 3% toll. That is in dispute between both those countries. And just in the last hour, Fars News, close to the IRGC in Iran, is saying it's not even based on a percentage, but it's a bunch of service fees depending on the service provided. But nevertheless, there seems to be a mechanism to collect a fee from ships passing through. That obviously stands in contrast to what the Washington and the Trump administration has been saying repeatedly and consistently, that we will not allow any tolls to be collected. So whether that happens between the two countries is the major step one. And then step two, does that go through with the blessing of the Trump administration? If so, then we definitely are watching a shift in the balance, because obviously there was no control of the strait before the war. There was certainly no fees being collected. And if all of those things do come to pass, then Iran has become more powerful in the region and is playing an important role in the architecture of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf.
Bahman, thank you. Well, some critics see the proposed agreement as a defeat for the Trump administration. Here's the view of a former US diplomat who worked under President Obama on the Iran nuclear deal in 2015.
The U.S. couldn't keep the strait open by force, so maritime traffic will go through it with Iranian sufferance only. That's unpleasant, but it's unavoidable. And this deal seems to encapsulate that unfortunate but inevitable new normal of Iran having control over maritime traffic going through the strait.
Well, President Trump's allies take a markedly different view. Here's Katie McFarland, who was the US Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump in 2017.
No tankers are getting into Iran. No commodities are getting into Iran by port. No Iranian oil is getting out in the tankers. So Iran's economic condition continues to degrade, if not to the point of almost collapse of their currency. So whatever Iran says, oh, they're going to talk to America, they're not going to talk to America, they're only going to talk to Oman, they're going to have tolls if they open it up. I mean, I think these are all kind of irrelevant. The bottom line is Iran is going to have to do what the United States wants.
Let's cross live and speak to our correspondent, Shaima Khalil. And Shaima, what do you think the Trump administration would make of the deal between Iran and Oman?
Well, I can bring you a line from a U.S. White House official who said that any temporary routes will be without any impediments, meaning no approvals or permissions and no tolls charged. The Strait of Hormuz is an international waterway and no party controls the lanes or the ability to transit through them. Translation, whatever Iran is agreeing with Oman, as we've seen it, call it fees, call it tolls. I think we should really underline the word control here, whether it's the vessels going in or going out, whatever the parameters are. The fact that Iran is proposing control of the Strait of Hormuz changes the nature of that crucial waterway from an international open waterway, as before the war, to an Iran-controlled waterway after the war. And I think these parameters are unacceptable to the United States. I will also say that a bit more of the complication, regardless of the fact that this has to go back to the Ayatollah in Tehran and his council, technical teams that have to go through this, we're also talking about vessels that go in that you have to consider insurers as well, because the catch-22 is, well, you pay Iran, what does that mean for insurance? I think that also adds to the complexity of this. But I think the parameters as they stand will be unacceptable to the Trump administration unless they decide to give Iran a huge win in these negotiations.
Shaima, thank you. Let's take a step back now and remind ourselves why the safety of the Strait of Hormuz is so important. Well, the passageway has effectively been closed since the war broke out in February, and that's had an implication on energy prices, supply chains and financial markets. And of course, the economic shockwaves are truly global. Well, let's speak to our correspondent, Samira Hussein. Samira, can you break down the importance of the Strait of Hormuz and explain what a deal between Iran and Oman could mean for the economy?
Look, 20% of world global oil supplies go through that strait, and it is absolutely critical. Now, once the strait was closed back in February, what we saw was that a lot of countries were depending on their oil reserves. A lot of countries keep oil reserves on hand. A lot of that had been depleted. So when we had this brief cessation of the war and there was then ships moving through the strait, we saw that countries were trying to increase their oil reserves to again give them that kind of safety. But now that we see that the strait is now closed again, countries haven't been able to rebuild their reserves, and the price of oil remains much higher than it was before the war. It is critical, especially if you go into the end of the summer and then when you start into the colder months, especially for the Western Hemisphere. I think not having any oil reserves is going to make it a very, very pricey winter for a lot of Western nations. And so it just highlights how critical it is to be able to open up that strait and to be able to do it as soon as possible so we can actually get some more oil flowing through.
Samira, thank you. Well, let's turn now to the fragile situation in Lebanon. 2 Israeli soldiers have been killed and 4 others severely injured in southern Lebanon. That comes as Israel resumed strikes on the country for the first time in more than a month. 1 person was killed and 11 wounded in those latest strikes. Fighting had decreased after Israel and Lebanon signed a US-sponsored deal in June. But Israeli forces still maintain control of much of southern Lebanon. The flare-up in violence coincides with the latest round of talks between Israel and Lebanon. Reporting from the Lebanese capital Beirut, here's Karine Torbay.
As the Lebanese and Israeli teams continued their talks in the U.S. embassy in the Italian capital Rome, Israel was intensifying its attacks in southern Lebanon amid concerns of a renewed escalation. 1 person was killed in Lebanon and others were injured in a number of Israeli strikes on villages in the Tyre district in South Lebanon. That's on Wednesday and today, Thursday. There was also Israeli artillery shelling of several towns. Israel said that those attacks were in response to what it claimed is Hezbollah's violation of the ceasefire after 2 Israeli soldiers were killed and 4 were seriously wounded after being hit by an explosive device in the southern town of Majd al-Zon. Hezbollah has not claimed responsibility for the attack, and it isn't clear when the explosive device was placed in the area that is currently under Israeli occupation and control. Another matter of concern in Lebanon is the repetition of incidents of Israeli civilians crossing into Lebanon. The Israeli army has said that 15 Israeli civilians damaged the border fence and entered Lebanon, and that they were all returned to Israel by the Israeli troops. This isn't the first time such an incident happens, and there are fears in Lebanon of this leading to a potential Israeli settlement activity on Lebanese occupied territory.
That was Karine Torbay. Well, our correspondent John Donison is in Jerusalem. He explained how this latest escalation could impact broader diplomatic efforts.
Now, the reason this matters in light of that broader deal with Iran and the United States is that Iran has said Lebanon must be part of any broader deal. There must be a ceasefire in Lebanon. So if we see a flare-up in violence there, and to be fair, it doesn't seem to have escalated beyond yesterday, that could threaten a broader deal between the US and Iran.
Well, whether you're joining us on YouTube, TikTok, Sounds, radio or TV, thank you for your time. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.